found ourselves in this position where people are queuing for hours for fuel?
We find ourselves in this position because of a complete failure of the government to lead and to plan ahead. I and other shadow cabinet colleagues wrote to Grant Shapps back in July highlighting these issues. We got a very short shrift from Grant Shapps, who wrote back to us in the first week of August, saying in his words that he wouldn't be using foreign labour to solve this issue. Now, the government says it wants to train up, and I'm absolutely in favour of training up HGV drivers, but it hasn't done that to a sufficient extent, nor has it, until recently, made a very small concession on being able to bring drivers in from abroad. So this is a catastrophic failure of leadership. It looks like we've ended up with petrol running out, the Prime Minister talking about bringing the army in. This is a crisis of the government's own making.
HGV drivers being offered a 3-month contract, pointless, is what we're being told by industry insiders. What would Labour do?
Well, we've already said that at this stage you'd have to be looking at a far larger number than that, and you'd have to be looking at more attractive and longer visas, and the number you would need is what you would need to solve the problem. But also, I asked, other shadow cabinet members asked months ago about planning for this eventuality. It's this government that has ended up in this situation through its chronic lack of planning and sheer incompetence.
So what number would you be looking at?
Well, the gap at the moment is 100,000. Now, I would like to be in a situation where we were able to do both things, having been training up drivers to take up those positions, and Labour would have been doing that for months and months in a way this government clearly isn't. Then, because it's a crisis, you fill the gap by offering visas, but you have to be confident that the visas that you are offering will attract enough drivers. So you've got to fill that gap. But the reason the government is in such a desperate situation is it hasn't been doing what it promised to do, both about training new HGV drivers, but also planning for the different scenarios this autumn.
So what would the visa look like if Labour was in power?
What I would be doing is taking advice as to precisely what the visa would need to be to attract the numbers. The government has got lots of different modelling in front of it. It will have lots of advice as to what the likely number of drivers you will attract for particular conditions is. It has to, I'm afraid, look a bit more than the 5,000 and the 3 months that is before it, if we are to listen to what most, it seems, across industry are saying, which is that's not going to work. You
can't criticise the government for saying 3 months is not enough if you don't have a figure yourselves.
Well, it's about choosing what precisely it is that is going to attract the number of drivers.
And what does Labour think that might be? I mean, obviously you've got your finger on the pulse, obviously. So what figure would Labour come up with?
It would be taking advice across industry properly, okay, as to what best figure, what best that is.
OK, well, I suppose what I'm trying to get to you, Mr Thomas-Symonds, this morning is, OK, Labour's not just sitting on their bottoms thinking, OK, it's your problem. I'm guessing you're having those conversations as well to try and be as constructive as possible for the people of Great Britain. My question is, as far as Labour is concerned, having had all those conversations as well, what do you think would be something attractive enough for European drivers to come to the UK?
But on the contrary, Kay, we haven't had those conversations. We wrote to Grant Shapps in July about this, asking about conversations for what we could do in terms of solving it. We actually asked Grant Shapps in July to refer this issue of visas to the Migration Advisory Committee to give expert advice on this, and we were completely dismissed and told that he wasn't going to use foreign labour at all. So it's no fault of ours that we haven't entered into a discussion and we haven't had access to that expert advice, because that is precisely what we asked to happen in July. We were just dismissed out of hand. And absolutely, if Grant Shapps had come back with a constructive response, I would have access to that advice from the Migration Advisory Committee and would be in a position to start giving you some more definitive positions. It is to the government's shame that they wouldn't even work with the opposition when we raised the scale of this crisis months in advance.
Government's right, though, isn't it, that we don't need the army. We're looking at this petrol station in Manchester as we speak to you. There are no queues anymore. There's only a finite amount of fuel that people can put in their vehicles, and the problem will resolve itself by the end of the week.
Well, it's remarkably complacent if the government is just sat there assuming what is going to happen in a few days. And I do worry the government isn't taking responsibility. We have a Prime Minister on the one hand was saying don't panic. On the other, he was saying that he needed to bring the army in. So I think you have to look at the mixed messaging from the government. And as always with this government, when it hits a crisis, it's always apparently somebody else's fault, rather than their failure to grip it and to plan for different scenarios in advance.
Problems not in Manchester this morning, as we can see, certainly at that fuel station, but there are in many other parts of the country. Should emergency and essential workers be able to jump the queue?
I think we do need to look at that, absolutely. But again, you're putting that question to me, Kay, and then on the other, the government is saying the problem is going to resolve itself. So yet again, you get into mixed messaging. But what an appalling position the government finds itself in. We are here in 2021. We are rationing petrol. We have a government that is threatening to bring the army in, and we have a supply crisis, all of which the government has been warned about, the government should have listened about, and through thorough incompetence, it now finds itself in this quite awful position this September.
OK. Those pesky earpieces, they're really irritating, aren't they? Hopefully you can still hear me as I'm chatting to you, Nick. So are you saying that emergency workers should be able to jump the queue, a bit like 2 decades ago when Labour had a similar issue getting petrol to the pumps, and there were special passes that were issued for emergency workers to be able to get fuel ahead of others?
Well, in crisis situations, you've clearly got to prioritise key workers. It isn't as if, you know, that's a contested definition. I mean, the government has used that key worker definition throughout the pandemic. I'm thinking, for example, in the lockdowns when, you know, key workers were still allowed to go out to work. So the government has all that on the books already as to who is a key worker. And of course, if you're prioritising keeping the country running, that's what you have to do. But goodness me, prioritising keeping the country running with a government that is rationing petrol, this is quite an appalling situation that this government has now reached. And there's no one to blame for it apart from them and their incompetence.
You're going to tell a conference that Labour should be tough on crime. What would Labour do about those protesters on the M25?
In terms of the protesters on the M25, of course, I am very passionate about tackling climate change. However, I do not believe that unlawful protest is the way to go about it. And I've been very clear that I support action that the police, the operational decisions police are taking on the front line. I also support the use of injunctions, because the problem is that when police do arrest people for breaking the law, which they are breaking the law, they can only stay in custody for a limited period and they can come back. So I think the use of injunctions is also very important. But the underlying issue of climate change, absolutely, I and Labour are very passionate about tackling.
Andy MacDonald, my goodness me, former colleague of yours in the shadow cabinet. What's all that about?
Well, look, people have resigned on points of principle before, and I always respect people who take that decision. Andy is a friend of mine and will continue to be a friend of mine. And I have great respect for the work he's done on the employment rights paper, where we will end appalling practices like fire and rehire. We will give people employment rights from day one. But I must say, in terms of the motion that's before conference today, the leadership is very happy for delegates to back it. We are very committed to a minimum wage of at least £10 an hour, but it is the responsible thing, as we get closer to the election, to look at rate of inflation, rate of wages, the wider economic situation, for the precise figure that we will put before the country at the next general election. But we are fighting for working people now, whether it is in terms of a minimum wage of at least £10, which, by the way, would be a 12% increase in wages for many people, whether it's in terms of cancelling the universal credit cut, whether it's speaking against the government's plans to hike national insurance, which are frankly a tax on working people as well. But of course, I wish Andy well on the backbenchers.
Yeah, but why did he have to do it at party conference? We broke the news to Rachel Reeve. Tamara Cohen did that yesterday. She looked visibly shocked at the discussion, at the news, I should say. I mean, why wash your dirty linen in public? Labour seems to do this year after year. You've got open goals left, right and centre, and you're washing your dirty laundry in public.
Well, look, only Andy can answer the question as to why he chose on that particular day to resign. It's always a difficult decision to make. But what I'm seeing at this conference is rule changes from Keir Starmer to ensure that the party will now be able to look outwards. People said that those rule changes wouldn't get through. They told Keir to back off, but he showed strong leadership and got them through. We're now in a situation where Rachel Reeve set out her stall yesterday. I'll be doing that today on Labour's priority on neighbourhood policing, making clear that if there is trouble on your street, Labour will make sure that somebody is there, and setting out my plans to put police hubs, neighbourhood prevention teams to tackle antisocial behaviour across the country. And tomorrow you will hear from Keir Starmer with his vision for the country as well.